Anthony Hobley.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. I hope you don't mind. My wife was meant to be here with me, but we both came back from Marrakesh last week with quite bad stomach infections. So again, if I rush off the stage quickly, you'll know why. But I promised I would take a picture of you all for her, so I hope you don't mind. Is that okay? Good. Just to prove I actually made it. Put this here so I don't forget that. Now, Carbon Tracker, what do? We were having a little bit of a discussion in the room back there about why Carbon Tracker has been so successful. And of course, for those of you who don't know, I'll explain a little bit more about who Carbon Tracker is and what we do in a moment. But for many of us who've been involved in the sort of climate space, climate advocacy, persuading the rest of society out there that this is an important issue and we have to do something about it, I think you have to sort of realize that we're actually quite weird to most people, that we care about these issues, a year, even more than a year in the future, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. I know when, I was an equity partner in the global law firm Norton Rose Fulbright, most of my, law firm partners, I struggled to get them to care about anything more than 12 months, in the future, beyond their next billable hours sort of target. Trying to get them to even do marketing for the following financial year was a struggle, let alone anything 3, 5, 10 years down the road. And I think what dawned on me is we've spent so long talking to the world out there about the issues we care about in our own language. Now, whether by accident or design, what Carbon Tracker sort of, I think, stumbled on was how to speak to its audience, the financial markets, in their language in the context of the issues they care about. Now, what do they care about? Basically, it's quite simple if you're in the financial markets, and I don't know how many people here are, but you care about, basically, when you make a decision, risk and reward. What's the risk when you make that investment decision, and does the potential reward, compensate you for taking that risk? And that's basically how, those are the two issues you have to talk to the financial markets about, risk and reward. But you also have to talk in their language. And you have to create a language that is relevant to them. So I think one of the huge successes of Carbon Tracker, who I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment, is to create a language that financial market professionals understand. So of course, post-financial crisis, everyone understands what a bubble is. So carbon bubble. Everyone understands in the financial markets what an asset is, so stranded assets. Everybody understands what CapEx is, so wasted CapEx. And now we're in the context of fossil fuels, now we're talking about demand destruction. Everyone understands what demand is for a product, and peak demand for a product. So, who are Carbon Tracker? Just for those who don't know, we are a not-for-profit financial think tank. We're entirely philanthropically funded. What's quite strange about us, yes, we are a climate NGO. We have a vision and a mission. Our vision is a climate-secure global energy system by 2050, which means net zero emissions by 2050. So we've got to get the whole global energy system at net zero emissions in the next 33 years. Anyone here in the energy sector knows that's a huge task. 33 years may sound like a long time, but in terms of the infrastructure and investment cycles in the energy sector, it is not. And the way we do that is by aligning climate risk with capital market risk, basically demonstrating through investment-grade financial analysis that climate risk and the risk of the low-carbon transition creates real financial risk and actually creates it now, but also on the other side of that coin creates huge financial opportunities. The other, I think, quite unique thing about Carbon Tracker is, we're not NGO types. We've all come out of the financial market. So I used to be a corporate lawyer and a partner in a global law firm. Our founder, Mark Campanale, is a former asset manager who built funds at Jupiter, Henderson's, and so on in the City of London. And the engine room of Carbon Tracker is 8 former investment bank analysts, ex-Barclays, HSBC, Citigroup, Deutsche Bank, etc. And one of the biggest spends every year is on commercial data from the likes of Rystad, Wood Mackenzie, and Bloomberg. And then we financially analyze that using our team of financial analysts. Now, of course, what we are most well known for, and still probably the most downloaded report of all of our numerous pieces of work, is our original sort of unburnable carbon report in 2011 and the wasted capital report of 2013. Now, this is not rocket science, and it still astounds me that this basic piece of analysis was not done by a commercial investment bank analytical team or boutique analytical house and published and put out there in a context and in a way the financial markets could understand. Basically, this was a translation of a key aspect of the climate science into financial market language. So the key aspect of the carbon science is the carbon budget. So we take the carbon budget, which gives us a 50% probability of staying below 2 degrees, which is about 2,000 gigatons against a pre-industrial baseline. So that means against the concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere before we started the Industrial Revolution, we can put about 2,000 gigatons in the atmosphere and gives us a 50% probability of staying below 2 degrees. The bad news is we've already used well over half of that. We have about 900, probably less, 900 gigatons left. Now, what that report did was a very simple comparison. Okay, what does that mean in the real world of financial analysts and asset managers and corporate lawyers and investment bankers? Well, where is all the carbon that's relevant to the financial markets? Well, the bulk of it is tied up in the world's oil, gas, and coal reserves and resources out to 2050. So how much carbon is in all of that oil, gas, and coal? About nearly 3,000 gigatons compared to 900. So you can see a massive differential. This is not marginal. Were we to burn all of that oil, gas, coal, we wouldn't be going to 2 degrees, we'd be going to 6 degrees a couple of times over. The comparison I often like to use is with the counting of nuclear missiles. A number of philanthropic NGOs started counting nuclear warheads back in the 70s and realized actually there are enough nuclear warheads out there to fry the planet 10 times over. And that's what woke everybody up and gave everyone nightmares and led to the anti-nuclear movements and peace demonstrations and disarmament. This is our modern day equivalent. But we can burn some of it. So the question is, and this is the key question where a lot of our work has focused over the last couple of years, is which is the best oil, gas, and coal to use from a climate and a financial perspective over the next 33 years, and which is the stuff we should now be mothballing and decommissioning and not even operationalizing. And that's the key question, because of course we're not going to turn fossil fuels off overnight. This is a transition. Now, Paris. If we were to implement Paris Agreement and the NDCs, the nationally determined commitments, these sort of bottom-up, country-by-country commitments that came under Paris, which we know are still not ambitious enough to get us to 2 degrees, maybe 2.5 if we're lucky, 3.5 if we're unlucky. Assuming we fully implement the NDCs, that would lead to a reduction in demand for fossil fuels across the board of around 10% by 2030. Yet, the world's major oil companies, as you can see from this slide, are predicting massive growth in demand for oil, gas, and coal between now and 2030 and 2040. So how do you square that disconnect? What is right? Well, we think, and we've done a lot of work on energy demand models, and we're doing some more with Imperial College in London, that companies are overstating energy demand, and they're grossly underestimating the role for renewables and ignoring looming changes in energy markets and infrastructure. When we've unpicked many of these demand models, we found a great degree of groupthink right across the energy sector. So in these models, quite often they pick the highest assumptions for things like GDP growth and population growth at one end, but the most pessimistic assumptions for the growth of things like solar, renewables, energy storage, electric vehicles at the other end. And lo and behold, what pops out at the other end is a very robust projection for growth in fossil fuel demand, which of course justifies very significant investments in finding and developing yet more oil, gas, and coal. Even when that new oil, gas, and coal was incredibly expensive and would require a very high oil, coal, or gas price to justify a return on that investment. Now, based on a more, what we think, sensible and conservative assessment of energy demand and looking at the 2 degrees transition, we think there are nearly $2 trillion of stranded assets in the making. That if spending plans from the major oil, gas, and coal companies and state oil and gas companies continue on a business-as-usual pathway, nearly $2 trillion will be stranded. And again, this is a very conservative estimate. So some $1.4 trillion in the oil sector, $220 billion in coal, and $520 billion in gas. We do not see any need for new oil and coal. We do see some limited need for more gas, but not as much as the industry would have you believe. And of course, sorry, I've just thrown in that little quote from the Financial Times, which of course we can't resist. I promise we didn't pay for this. I don't think philanthropic funders would let us pay for this sort of advertising. But of all the recent ideas climate change campaigners have come up with to convince the world to do more to curb global warming, none has been as potent as the concept of stranded fossil fuel assets. And even governors of major central banks are starting to agree. So Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, Chair of the Financial Stability Board, has talked about the risks of an abrupt transition. So again, if we do not start to get the trajectory down, if we do not start to disinvest from the projects, the fossil fuel projects that make neither climate nor financial sense, we'll be setting ourselves up for a very bumpy ride, a very disruptive transition. We still have a chance for an orderly transition, which actually, and we'll come to this in a minute, could be a very good thing for the oil and gas companies themselves. Might be better for their share price, their dividend, and their business models than continuing this sort of growth-type approach. This sort of head in the sand, the world isn't changing, the world's going to be the same as it was for the last 80 years, and growth for oil, gas, and coal is just going to continue to grow as it did before. One of the things that he's asking for, again, and many shareholders are now asking the companies for, is not necessarily to change their business models right now, but to start stress testing those business models. I mean, that's what you would do, right? When there's a potential risk in the future, or you know that there's potential for a change, you would stress test your business model. You would understand as a business what those risks are and how you might prepare for them. But of course, Chevron and Exxon don't agree. They've resisted those shareholder resolutions, even though 40-odd% of their shareholders voted for them to do that sort of stress testing, which you would think is only prudent. It may be that the Financial Stability Board Climate Risk Task Force will come up with a set of recommendations we believe to be published for consultation on the 14th of December that may ask for that. Now, as I said, investors are starting to get concerned about this. So when surveyed by Ernst & Young EY, 2/3 of investors said they are concerned about stranded asset risk. 38%, as I said, of Exxon shareholders and 41% of Chevron shareholders voted for a shareholder resolution which would have required those companies to carry out this sort of stress testing, assessment of the risks. So again, not asking them to change anything they're doing, but simply to stress test and understand the risks of a 2 degrees C world or energy transition. Again, which you would think is fairly prudent. Now, to be fair, some of the oil and gas companies have voluntarily responded to this. So Total and Shell have released 2 degrees C stress test plans. We have some issues with those plans, but it is a very positive step in the right direction. We also, as we went from our unburnable carbon work in 2011 and 2013 and built our team of investment analysts, bought the commercial data, and started doing our deep dive analysis into all of the world's oil, gas, and coal projects, putting them on cost curves to see which were the high carbon, high cost projects that, as I said, make neither climate nor financial sense. We began to feel intuitively that actually putting these companies on an X-growth pathway, which aligns with 2 degrees C, might actually be good for them. Because our demand analysis and financial analysis is telling us that they are facing a perfect storm of risks to their business model. And actually climate policy and things like carbon pricing are at the bottom of that list. Fossil fuels have now lost their monopoly on energy generation. It's still early days, but the emerging technologies, clean technologies, are now becoming cost competitive. They're scaling up. In many, many places in the world, they actually are cost competitive or even cheaper than a fossil fuel alternative without government support or subsidies. That trend is only going in one direction. Yet the costs of finding and developing and bringing fossil fuels to market is going in the other direction, up, becoming ever more complex and expensive. So when we put that into practice and we stress tested their business models against a 2 degrees C pathway, we came to the conclusion that they could be worth more, some 100 billion more, if they were on an X-growth 2 degrees C pathway. That would be good for the companies, and that would be good for the shareholders. So to conclude, as I see I'm out of time, we've been here before, many times in business history. It is a truth that no matter how big they are, no matter how politically well connected, how rich they are, when a technological transition begins, most incumbents almost always fail to survive that technological transition. If that was not the case, I think these cameras, the cameras in our smartphones would probably be manufactured by Kodak, who would have a big share of the digital photography market. They clearly don't. The computers, the laptops that we all use, at least some of them will be manufactured by typewriter manufacturers like Olivetti. And the cars that we drive and use would probably be manufactured by the people who used to manufacture railways and steam locomotives, none of which is true. One of my most favorite speeches is by the chairman of Baldwin. They were the second biggest steam locomotive manufacturer and manufacturer of everything you needed to run a railway, a big name in the Dow Jones in the late 19th century, early 20th century. They'd just made a major investment in the late 1920s, early 1930s in the next generation of super efficient steam locomotives. Their shareholders were getting worried about the money they were spending and the competition from new technologies. Two technological upstarts had just entered the Dow Jones in 1930, I think called General Motors and Ford. So the chairman made a big speech on Wall Street to all their investors and said, mark my words, steam locomotion will be the dominant form of transport until well into the 1980s and beyond. This automobile thing will only ever be a plaything. It will never take off. Don't worry about it. It'll be a plaything for the rich and famous. Ordinary people will not use it. Baldwin was bankrupt and asset stripped within 16 years of him having made that speech. I guess the question for the big names of today, BP, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, is will history repeat itself, or will they escape that, buck that trend? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here and to talk to you.